Okay, so this is my initial impressions of the Kyosho Ultima RT6 stadium truck. I just got back from a race today, so I had a chance to do some track testing with this. I raced multiple classes today, four-wheel buggy, two-wheel stock buggy, stock short course, and mod stadium truck. All my other chassis are more or less dialed into my track, so I spent a little bit more time trying to get this tuned in. So let's see. Before I get to the tuning or the particular setup that I have, I'll talk a little bit about logistics, if you will. So first, I don't have a body yet painted for this, so I just used my old T4 body and cut new holes in it to align with the holes on the RT6. And it turns out I didn't have to do that much work. The rear two holes that you would use on a T4 body actually align perfectly with the RT6 rear holes. And then I just had to cut two holes at the front here for the front body posts. Now, the thing is, let me just put this body on. Let's see, right there. Okay, so if you, because the posts are so close to the front of this body, and it's really more the fault of the body than the actual posts themselves, because of the way the nose is shaped and how it has this sort of ridge here, this in the front. If you try to mount the pins laterally, they run up against this little ridge, and then you can unscrew this little cap here and just kind of rotate it in a whole bunch of different ways to make the body clip point in different directions. If you try to go straight forward or backward, then either the front or the back of the body clip actually protrudes in front of the nose. So if you lawn dart a jump or something, it could pop the body clip off or just dig into the dirt. So I ended up mounting the nose clips kind of diagonally like this. It's still not perfect. Let me see if I can give you an example here. Just like that, right? So it does protrude a little bit out in front of at least the top portion of the nose. And I did already lose one body clip this way. Somehow it popped out. I figured if I put it in this way, if I hit something, it should push the body clip in, not out. But apparently that didn't happen. So anyway, I'll have to figure out, because I bought another Proline Bulldog body, just a newer one that's not beat up, to use for this. So I'll have to see if I can find a better way to mount the body, at least for the front portion. Okay, as for the electronics, the way that I ended up doing this was to put the receiver here. And the reason for that is because in the manual, they actually want you to tape the receiver here in this tiny little spot here. And that certainly doesn't fit with these older Spectrum receivers. I'm not sure if even the newer ones can fit in there, possibly, maybe. But anyway, I have my receiver here, my speed controls on a little tray that they give you up here. This is a Novak GTB3. And it comes with the power capacitors integrated onto the same board as the rest of the speed control. So it's a little fat. But the advantage is that you don't have these wires coming off of the speed control for power capacitors that can end up getting clipped or something. The disadvantage, again, is that it's fatter. I did initially try to mount a Reedy black box here, but the problem I had was finding a place to mount the power capacitors. And the way that all this plastic is kind of contoured, there was no good place for me to put that power cap, given the length of the wire that you get with the Reedy black box speed control. Maybe someone else has found a better solution than I have, but I just couldn't figure out a really good way to mount it. So I went with my GTB3, and there you go. Running a Reedy Sonic Mach 285 with a 22-tooth pinion. The truck comes with an 80-tooth spur. This combination is pretty good. It's fairly smooth. It's not, too much power. It's plenty fine. So for what I need, it's perfectly fine. I did find myself having to tighten the diff throughout the day as the diff broke in. I started off at a kind of a moderate setting, and then after the first few practice runs, it got loose. So it's, this little feature I talked about in one of the build videos, this little clip. This actually just pops right off fairly easily. Although it's a little bit hard to reach, it can pop off, and then you put the hex driver in there, and you just kind of, you hold this wheel and you rotate this wheel until the little slot lines up with the slot in the thrust bolt, and then you can just turn this wheel left or right to loosen or tighten the diff. It's actually a really cool little feature. So, I did that a couple of times throughout the day. Let's see. That was sort of, it in terms of the electronics. And oh, right. Sorry, one more thing. The battery. This little tray here that you mount, it actually has a longer sort of piece that I clipped off. This gets in the way of actually being able to mount a shorty pack in because this space here is not, it's shorter than the shorty pack length. So you have to like bend this up to, really fit the shorty pack in there. So I cut this down to make that a little bit easier to get it in. And likewise for the actual sort of plate here, I had to cut down the length of this so it doesn't run into speed control. But I think I made it a little bit too short, because if I try to take this guy and flip it around so this nose is pointing out this way, this piece isn't long enough to sit under this cap here. Also, I'd have to cut this down even further if I wanted to flip it around, because it would end up hitting the speed control. So it is a little bit tight getting a shorty lipo into and out of this assembly. Let's see, and I'm already on the rearmost sort of hole here on the chassis for mounting this brace. So, maybe I can just shave this down a little bit further so that, it still captures this lid here, but I just have a little bit more room to, mount the lipo in and out. That's probably the way to go there. In terms of how the car performed, I didn't have to really do anything to the front suspension, in terms of the roll center or anything like that. For the rear, I had to play a few games. The initial shock oil that I used a 30 weight front, 25 weight rear. It was too light for the track I was on. The outdoor season hasn't quite started yet, so as you can see with these suburbs here, I was running on an indoor track. So it was actually pretty high grip, and I had to go up a bit in the shock oil. So right now I'm running 32.5 weight front and rear shock oil, and that does pretty well. And the ride height on this truck, it's not difficult to get something like a 30 millimeter ride height. The reason for that has to do with the length of the springs. So if I try to go, say, any higher up than this on the shock collar, there will be a gap between the spring and the shock collar so that the spring can kind of move around. And that's how you would get actually a lower ride height on this truck. But that's not very useful if the spring's kind of floating around like that. So you want to tend to run the shock collar at the very least down to a point where it just barely touches the spring. If you're running any shallower than that, then the spring's going to move around. It's going to float effectively. So with that setting, the truck actually sits pretty high. So if I want to get it to sit lower, I would have to put down travel limiters into the shocks, or I'd have to find a way to basically, maybe run a bottom spring cup here that sits taller to push the whole spring up, and then I can run this a little shallower. Maybe that would do the trick. I'm not sure. So it does run right now. I think it's about 30 front, 28 rear. I'd like to run maybe 2 millimeters lower than that, because the truck was really rolling quite a lot, at least on the relatively high grip indoor track I was running on. So I had tried to accommodate that using other tricks. Initially, the stock setting for the ball stud here, the inner ball stud on the camber link, is actually on the outside hole. So that's a higher camber gain setting than putting it on the inside hole. So I tried mounting to the inside hole to get less camber gain. That gave me a little bit more forward traction on corner exit. That worked okay, but the truck was still rolling too much in the corners. So I went back to the stock setting here because I wanted to change just one thing at a time. So back to the if you want to call it a higher camber gain setting. And then I played with the rear shocks. Because I remember on the T4 that I had, which is, the same kind of platform, rear motor, weight distribution is about the same. I actually ran on the T4 shock tower, I drilled a 4th hole on the inside to help lay the shocks down. And that made a world of a difference on the T4. And in addition to that, I ran some more up travel limiters on the shocks so that even though the chassis rolls, the up travel limiter will keep the chassis from rolling too much. Okay, it will limit how much the maximum roll is. It also limits the total suspension travel on jump landings, so it can bottom out if you're landing off of a really big jump. But for the particular amount of up travel limiters I put in there, at full compression, the rear bumper doesn't scrape the ground, which is good for preserving the bumper. So it kind of serves two purposes for me, at least. I get to preserve the rear bumper a little bit, and I also limit the amount of roll, which limits, basically over-rolling the chassis and the rear kind of getting loose on you mid-corner. There was one particular turn coming off of the back straight, and then it's a tight hairpin, and every time I approached it, actually with any of my cars, the cars tend to turn in pretty sharply, and as it does so with this truck, because it's riding high, suspension's kind of soft, the rear will roll quite a lot, and it would start to slide. So putting up travel limiters on the shocks helps with that. It doesn't change the tendency to roll, but it changes the maximum amount of roll, which is good enough for what I wanted to accomplish for today. Otherwise, the truck ran fine. It's smooth. Suspension's great. Drivetrain's great. I just need to spend more time setting it up. So, just because the setup isn't perfect as it is right now out of the box doesn't mean the truck is bad. The truck's actually fine. I just need to work on it a little bit. But right now, with the rear shock settings that I have, I think this helps quite a bit. Maybe I'll start playing around with spring tensions or something, maybe using different manufacturer springs to see if I can get a longer spring in the rear or something like that. I tried looking at the associated springs, and they're actually a little bit too short, but I think those are the buggy rear springs. I'd have to look at the truck springs to see if those will fit right. What else did I want to mention? Yeah, so it's really just a matter of getting the correct ride height. It sits a little high with the stock setting, with the stock springs and everything they give you. I might also want to change the pistons. As I mentioned in the build series, it comes with 5-hole pistons. I think they're 5 by 1.2 millimeter pistons. So it's quite a lot of open area for oil to flow through. So the slow damping rate is going to be very low. But because there are a lot of holes, there's also a lot of perimeter around the holes, which gives you more pack. So landing off of jumps, you get more pack, but in the corners, the truck will tend to roll a lot. So I would want to go down to maybe a 2-hole or 3-hole piston that would help keep the truck from rolling too much. Although, it would give me less pack, so the truck might, bottom out a little more in jumps. So I'll have to play around definitely with the pistons and, see what I can do about the ride height. But otherwise, that's pretty much it for my first impressions. I like it. It's a cool truck, and I look forward to, the next several months running it. So thanks for watching.